When we look at the international arena, we must discard liberal illusions about international law, institutions, or morality, and focus on the hard logic of power and the survival of states. What we are observing today in the context of Volodymyr Zelensky's demands for his international recognition as a legitimate president is a classic example of how political leaders attempt to maneuver in conditions where their strategic position is hopelessly deteriorating. To understand why this is happening and where it will lead, we must analyze the situation through the lens of offensive realism. First of all, let's clarify the situation from the perspective of the great powers. In an international system that is anarchic by nature, states always strive to ensure their security. And great powers, such as the United States of America and Russia, play a zero-sum game. Ukraine, in this game, is not an independent player, but a buffer state caught between the interests of the West and the fundamental security interests of the Kremlin. When Zelensky demands that Moscow reconsider its position regarding the expiration of his term in May 2024, he is effectively trying to trade thin air. In the world of realpolitik, legitimacy stems not from legal documents, but from the ability to control territory and possess a monopoly on violence, as well as from recognition by other significant players. The Russian position here is extremely rational from the standpoint of their national interests. Vladimir Putin and the Russian leadership understand perfectly well that recognizing Zelensky as a legitimate partner now is a voluntary surrender of a powerful lever of pressure. If the Kremlin declares that there is no lawful authority in Kiev, it reserves the right to dictate terms of surrender or settlement to any subsequent regime, or simply ignore the current one, continuing to grind down Ukrainian armed forces on the battlefield. This is a classic strategy of attrition. For Russia, the question of Zelensky's legitimacy is not a legal dispute, but a tool for delegitimizing the entire political system of Ukraine, which they view as a hostile Western outpost. Zelensky, in turn, is in a desperate position. His attempt to put forward additional conditions at a moment when the front is cracking and Western support is becoming increasingly uncertain looks exactly like the gesture of despair that German newspapers write about. He understands that without formal recognition, his signature on any document is not even worth the paper it is written on. The irony is that he's trying to blackmail Moscow with a lack of concessions, but he has virtually no cards left to play. In great geopolitics, concessions are made by the one who is losing on the ground, and on the ground, Ukraine is losing territories, resources, and, most importantly, people. Special attention should be paid to the role of the United States of America in this drama. We see how the administration of Donald Trump, or those preparing for his return, are beginning to put pressure on Kiev. Trump is a realist to his core, even if he does not use the terminology. His approach to foreign policy is built on deals and cost minimization. For him, Ukraine is a liability that consumes American resources without bringing an adequate return. In the context of the main challenge for the U.S., which is China, and therefore, Trump's requirement for holding elections in Ukraine is a way to create a new political reality in which a deal can be struck with Putin. However, an interesting collision arises here. Putin put forward a condition that millions of Ukrainians living in Russia must participate in the elections. This is a brilliant tactical move. If Kyiv agrees, it recognizes Russia's influence over its internal political process. If it refuses, it confirms its illegitimacy in the eyes of Moscow and part of the international community. Zelensky understands that any honest elections in current conditions are his political end. His rating is falling, war fatigue is colossal, and corruption scandals, which so concern Washington, undermine his authority. Look at the proposal of Foreign Minister Sabiha, the idea that Ukraine will make peace with the U.S. and then the Americans will negotiate with Russia. Is an attempt to escape reality. It is a recognition that Ukraine is no longer a subject, but the Kremlin will not accept such a construction. Why? Because great powers do not want intermediaries in matters of their existential security. Russia wants to negotiate with the U.S. directly about a new security architecture in Europe where Ukraine will be neutralized. Zelensky, in this scheme, is a redundant link. His demand to be recognized as president is an attempt to insert himself back into an equation from which he is being erased. We must understand that in international relations, might Malin determines right. When the balance of power shifts, treaties and recognitions change following it. Now, the balance of power in Ukraine is shifting in favor of Russia. Western elites are beginning to realize that their project of turning Ukraine into an unsinkable NATO aircraft carrier on Russia's border has failed. Now they are looking for a way out that would allow them to save face. Elections are an ideal exit. This allows for a change of leader, blaming failures in the predecessor, and starting negotiations with a clean slate. Zelensky sees in this a threat not only to his power, but also to his physical safety. History knows many examples of leaders who, having become unnecessary to their great patrons, ended badly. His persistence on the issue of legitimacy is a struggle for survival. He is trying to force the US and Russia to recognize him as the only possible interlocutor, but the problem is that neither Moscow nor, apparently, the new administration in Washington thinks so. Discussing the visit of Special Envoy Dmitriev to Miami, we see the channels of back-channel diplomacy that are always activated when official institutions reach a dead end. Russia is conveying a simple thought to Trump: we will not sign agreements with a person whose right to sign is contested. This creates a legal and political vacuum that Russia intends to fill on its own terms. If there is no lawful authority in Kyiv, then Russia can continue the military operation until the authority that suits it is established. Let's be honest. The conflict in Ukraine is the result of a catastrophic mistake by the West, which decided it could expand NATO indefinitely without considering the security interests of a nuclear power. Now, when the consequences of this error have become obvious, Ukraine is paying the highest price. Zelensky is a tragic figure in this sense. He became a hostage to a policy he did not fully control. His current demands for recognition are a cry for help into the void. In the great game of powers, small states often become bargaining chips. If the US decides that to contain China, they need to normalize relations with Russia, or at least freeze the conflict in Europe, they will do so without asking Kyiv's opinion. If this requires replacing Zelensky through elections or another way, they will do it. Realism teaches us that moral obligations to allies always come second to national interests. The situation with elections in Ukraine also exposes the hypocrisy of the liberal world order. On the one hand, the West talks about democracy. On the other, it supports the cancellation of elections under the pretext of war. But when strategic necessity requires regime change, democratic values suddenly become relevant again. Trump uses anti-corruption investigations as a bludgeon to force Zelensky into submission. This is good old power politics disguised as a fight for legality. As for Russia's position, it remains unchanged since February 2022. They need a neutral Ukraine, and they don't care who signs the document, provided that person possesses real power and recognized legitimacy. If Zelensky cannot provide this, Russia will wait or create new conditions on the battlefield. So we are in a moment of truth. All this noise around Zelensky's conditions is just ripples on the deep ocean of geopolitical shifts. The main trend is clear. The era of US unipolar dominance has ended, and now great powers are returning to the classic struggle for spheres of influence. Ukraine is the field of this struggle. Zelensky is trying to hold on to slipping power by putting forward demands that no one intends to fulfill. This is not a strategy, it is the agony of a political course that led the country into a dead end. Ultimately, Ukraine's fate will be decided in Washington and Moscow, not in Kyiv. And that is the harsh reality that we as analysts must recognize if we want to understand where the world is heading. The world will not become kinder just because we ignore these facts. On the contrary, only by understanding the hard logic of interest can we hope for some semblance of stability. But as long as leaders in Kyiv live in illusions of their indispensability, and leaders in the West continue to feed these illusions, the conflict will continue, bringing new victims and destruction. Legitimacy is not asked for. You either have it or you don't. And now it seems that Zelensky's time as a legitimate player is inexorably running out, regardless of what conditions he puts forward. When we analyze the actions of leaders like Zelensky through the prism of realism theory, we must understand that their behavior is dictated not by personal whims, but by the structural pressure of the international system. However, in this case, we see a rare combination of structural crisis and personal political survival. Zelensky found himself in a situation that I call the proxy state trap. He is completely dependent on external support, but this support is provided only as long as he serves the purposes of his patrons. As soon as his goals begin to diverge from the goals of the US, he becomes a burden. His demand for the Kremlin to reconsider its position on his legitimacy is an attempt to force Russia to play by his rules. But Russia is not a power that can be forced to do something that contradicts its long-term strategy. Moscow sees the delegitimization of Zelensky as the key to a full revision of the foundations of Ukrainian statehood. If the president is illegitimate, then all his decrees, including the ban on negotiations with Putin, can be annulled by a new leadership. This opens the way to a legally significant renunciation of claims to Crimea and the 4 new regions. It is interesting to observe how the Western press, in particular, John Schwelt, is beginning to change its tone, calling Zelensky's conditions a gesture of despair, They are preparing public opinion for the possibility that support for this leader may be terminated. In international politics, media often serves as an instrument for transmitting signals from elites. The signal here is clear. Zelensky is becoming unable to negotiate and too expensive. Trump, being a proponent of the America First approach, sees in this situation an opportunity for a quick solution. His pressure on the issue of elections is not a concern for democracy in Ukraine, but an attempt to create a legitimate subject who can sign a peace on terms acceptable to Russia so that the U.S. can exit this conflict and focus on Asia. But Zelensky resists because for him, elections mean loss of power and possibly trial within the country for what his policy led to. The Russian condition of voting for millions of Ukrainians in Russia is checkmate. This condition makes holding elections practically impossible for the current Kiev regime, as these voters clearly will not vote for the continuation of the war. Thus, Zelensky finds himself caught between the hammer of American demands and the anvil of Russian conditions. Sabih's proposal that the U.S. should negotiate with Russia behind Ukraine's back is, in essence, an admission of the bankruptcy of Ukrainian diplomacy. It is an attempt to shift responsibility for inevitable territorial losses onto Washington. But Washington does not want to take this responsibility alone. They want the Ukrainian leader himself to sign the document so as not to be accused later of betraying an ally. This entire situation with international recognition is a smokescreen. The real question is how much longer Ukraine can hold the front and when the point of collapse will come. Great powers have already begun to discuss the contours of the post-war world. And in this world, Zelensky's status is just a minor detail that will be easily discarded for the sake of achieving a grand deal. We must remember that in the world of realism, there is no place for sentiments. The state pursues its interests, and the interests of the U.S. now consist of preventing a direct clash with Russia and not letting China take advantage of the exhaustion of American arsenals. If this requires sacrificing Zelensky's political future, it will be done without hesitation. His attempts to set conditions are the rearguard battles of a politician who understands that his time is running out. Ultimately, history will judge whether Ukraine had a chance to follow the path of neutrality and avoid this catastrophe. But now we have what we have: a destroyed country, a leader clinging to power through formal demands for recognition, and great powers preparing to redraw the map of the world. And no demands for legitimacy will change the fact that power is on the side of the one who has more resources, more soldiers, and more determination to use them. This is the essence of international politics. And Zelensky, to his misfortune, is learning this lesson too late. Continuing this reasoning, it is worth looking at how the international system reacts to such crises of legitimacy. In history, there have been many cases where leaders who lost real power or control over territory continued to insist on their official status. But as soon as the great powers found them a replacement or decided that a deal with the opponent was more important, these claims instantly vanished. In the case of Ukraine, we see how legal casuistry is used to cover a strategic impasse. Zelensky claims that without his recognition, Moscow will not receive concessions. But let us ask ourselves, what exactly are the concessions Moscow needs from the current Kiev regime? Russia's already taking what it needs: force and weapons. It is creating facts on the ground. In the realist tradition, facts on the ground are always more important than words on paper. If Russia controls the Donbass, Crimea, and the land corridor, it does not need formal permission from a person whose power it does not recognize. It will simply wait until someone more realistic replaces him or until the international community recognizes the new status quo de facto. Trump's pressure on Zelensky through corruption cases is a classic example of how a great power disciplines its client. The U.S. possesses a vast array of information on the internal affairs of Ukraine, using this information now as a signal to Zelensky that his protection by Washington is not absolute. This is a form of coercion to peace on American terms. Trump does not want an endless war. He wants a victory, or at least a ceasefire that can be presented as a success. The absence of lawful authority in Kiev, as pointed out by the Kremlin, is not just a formality. It is a fundamental obstacle to any stable settlement. No serious statesman will conclude a fateful treaty with a counterparty whose powers can be contested the very next day. Russia has learned the lessons of the Minsk agreements and no longer intends to sign documents that will not be executed. Therefore, the question of the legitimacy of power in Kiev is primary for Moscow. When we hear about visits of people like Dmitriev in Miami to Trump's circle, we understand that the contours of the future deal are already being drawn, and in these contours, Ukraine is assigned the role of a passive object. Zelensky's demands for recognition in this context look like an attempt to disrupt negotiations in which he is not participating. He fears that he will simply be presented with a fait accompli, and frankly speaking, his fears are justified. Such is the fate of small states that allow themselves to be drawn into the rivalry of great powers. We must also consider the psychological aspect. Zelensky built his image on resistance and uncompromising stance. For him, recognizing his illegitimacy or going to elections that he might lose means destroying this image. But in geopolitics, image is cheap when the interests of national security of great powers are at stake. The U.S. can support this image exactly as long as it serves their goals. As soon as it begins to interfere, they will destroy it. The situation with millions of Ukrainians in Russia having the right to vote is an example of how Russia uses soft power and the demographic factor in combination with hard power. This undermines the very foundation of the Ukrainian identity that Kyiv has tried to build in recent years. If these people vote, the political landscape of Ukraine will change forever. Zelensky knows this, and that is why his enthusiasm for elections has faded. Ultimately, it all comes down to the balance of power. Ukraine cannot win a war of attrition against Russia without direct NATO intervention. NATO is not going to intervene directly, as that would mean a third world war. Consequently, Ukraine will have to make concessions. The only question is who will sign them and when. Zelensky is trying to delay this moment by demanding recognition, but he is only delaying the inevitable. The world is watching a gesture of despair from a leader who realized he was used and is now being prepared for disposal. This is a harsh lesson for everyone who believes in the disinterested help of great powers or that international law will protect the weak in the real world, the world I describe in my works. Security is ensured only by force and a reasonable understanding of the limits of one's capabilities. Ukraine crossed these limits and is now paying the price. Thus, analysis of the situation shows that Zelensky's new conditions are not a position of strength, but a sign of deep weakness. This is an attempt to cling to legal formalities in a world where cannons speak. Moscow will not back down from its position, and Washington will continue to pressure until it gets the desired result. And in this game, Zelensky has less and less room for maneuver. The future of Ukraine is being decided now, and it will likely be very different from what was promised to the people in Kyiv over the last few years. Reflecting further on the dynamics of this conflict, it is impossible not to notice how predictable all sides' actions are from the standpoint of realism theory. When a state finds itself in an existential threat situation like Ukraine, it begins to behave increasingly erratically, trying to grasp at any straw. Zelensky, by putting forward demands for international recognition, is effectively asking the West and Russia for guarantees of his personal political future. But in great geopolitics, guarantees are given to states, not individual leaders, especially if those leaders become an obstacle to stabilizing the system. Let's return to the question of the U.S. Why are elections in Ukraine so important to them right now? Besides a change of leader, it is a way to restore at least a semblance of the democratic process to justify further support or, conversely, an exit from the game. If new elections bring to power a government ready for negotiations, Washington can say it is the will of the Ukrainian people, and thereby remove the responsibility for the loss of territories. This is a classic way to exit a losing proxy war. Russia, meanwhile, is playing the long game. For the Kremlin, non-recognition of Zelensky is not just a diplomatic damok, it is part of a strategy for the full dismantling of the political regime established after the events of 2014. They view this regime as illegal in its essence. The expiration of Zelensky's term in 2024 simply gives them a convenient legal pretext to solidify this position. Putin understands that time is on his side. The longer the conflict continues, the weaker Ukraine becomes and the less desire the West has to support it. Zelensky's demand to reconsider Moscow's position is an attempt to flip the board. He wants Russia to recognize its legitimacy before serious negotiations begin. But why would Russia do that? In realism, you don't give an opponent what they desperately want for nothing, especially if it is your main lever of influence. And Russia will use the issue of legitimacy to dictate the terms of Corman. Any future government in Kyiv. It is also interesting to observe Europe's reaction. A German newspaper calling Zelensky's action a gesture of despair reflects the growing frustration of European elites. Europe bears huge economic costs to this conflict, and they want its conclusion no less than Trump. However, they are more bound by their own rhetoric about values and democracy. Replacing Zelensky through elections could be a lifebuoy for them, allowing a change of course without admitting defeat. Sabiha's proposal for a peace deal through U.S. mediation is, in essence, an admission that Ukraine has turned into a protectorate. But the tragedy of protectorates is that their fate is decided in the metropoles. If the U.S. and Russia agree on a division of spheres of influence, Kiev's opinion will be considered last. We saw this with Yalta. We have seen this in many other conferences of great powers. Ukraine is no exception here. Why does Zelensky see risks to his own safety in elections? Because a massive internal tension has accumulated in Ukraine. The war wrote off many mistakes. But as soon as a political campaign begins, all questions from corruption to strategic blunders at the front will come to the fore. Moreover, in war conditions, holding elections is technically impossible without a ceasefire. And a ceasefire at the current lines of contact will be perceived by many inside Ukraine as a surrender. Zelensky fears not only losing, but also the wrath of those who thought victory was near. Trump's position here is perfectly pragmatic. He wants to clear the table before moving on to more important matters. If this requires pressing Kiev, he will press. Using corruption investigations is just the beginning. We could see a freeze on financial aid or other forms of pressure if Zelensky continues to resist. In international anarchy, the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. This is an old truth that Ukraine is now learning through its own bitter experience. This entire story with Dmitriev's letter and the negotiations in Miami shows that real diplomacy happens in the shadows. Official statements are just a cover for bargaining, and the subject of this bargaining is not only the territory of Ukraine, but also its political structure, its alliances, and its future leadership. Zelensky is trying to wedge himself into this bargain with his conditions, but his voice sounds increasingly quiet. I've always said that NATO expansion was the greatest strategic error since the end of the Cold War. We are now reaping the fruits of this mistake. Ukraine became a victim of the West's ambitions and its own inability to understand geopolitical reality. Now, as the endgame is near, we see leaders trying to save themselves while forgetting the country. Zelensky's conditions are not about peace for Ukraine. They are about the survival of his regime. But in a world of great powers, regimes come and go while geography remains. Russia will always be Ukraine's neighbor, and it will always possess superior power. Any lasting settlement must account for this fact. Zelensky's attempts to ignore this reality through demands for formal recognition are doomed to failure. The only way to peace is the recognition of the new realities of power and building a system where the security interests of all major players are balanced. Ukraine in this system must be neutral and stable, not an instrument of pressure for one side against another. Summarizing this part of the analysis, we can say that we are witnessing a classic crisis of a client state. When the client's goals begin to threaten the patron's interests, or when the cost of maintaining the client becomes too high, the patron begins searching for ways to change the leadership or the terms of the deal. Zelensky feels this and resists, using the last levers he has. But against the logic of realism and the interests of the great powers, he has no chance. The world is moving toward a new détente in this region. And this détente will likely occur at the expense of the current Ukrainian leadership. To understand what is happening more deeply, it is necessary to realize that in international politics, there is a huge gap between what leaders say publicly and what considerations actually guide them. Zelensky publicly demands justice, recognition, and a return to the borders of '91. But behind closed doors, he is fighting just to stay in the game. His demand for legitimacy is an attempt to secure legal immunity from the future. Russia, meanwhile, acts from a position of strength accumulated over the years. For them, recognizing Zelensky as illegitimate is a way to say to the whole world, we will not deal with this Western project. This is a signal not only to Kiev, but to all other countries in the post-Soviet space. Russia is setting the rules in its own backyard, and one of these rules says that leaders who go against Moscow's security interests ultimately lose their legitimacy. Trump understands this rule, despite his unpredictability. His foreign policy is always aimed at reducing obligations that do not bring direct benefit to the U.S. Ukraine is a classic over-obligation. To get rid of it while saving face, he needs a process that would look legitimate. Elections fit this role perfectly. If Zelensky refuses elections, he gives Trump an excuse to say, we cannot defend democracy where they do not want to hold elections. This is the perfect pretext to stop support. Thus, Zelensky finds himself in a logical dead end. If he agrees to elections, he loses power and faces risk from Russia, which will demand the participation of millions of pro-Russian citizens. And if he refuses elections, he loses U.S. support. His new conditions are an attempt to find a third way where he is recognized without elections and without concessions. But in international politics, a third way usually does not exist. There is only the path of power and the path of submission. We must also consider the time factor. Every day, the conflict continues. Ukraine's negotiating position worsens. The army is exhausted, infrastructure is destroyed, and Western society is increasingly tired of the war expenses. Under these conditions, time is Russia's best ally. Putin can afford to wait. Zelensky cannot. His demand for recognition is an attempt to speed up the process on his terms. So far, the situation at the front has not become fully catastrophic, but Moscow will not rush. They see that the West is starting to waver. They see that within the U.S., there is no unity on the issue of Ukraine. In such a situation, why would they give Zelensky what he asks for? From the standpoint of offensive realism, Russia will continue to pressure until Ukraine is brought to a state where it accepts any conditions without any prior demands for legitimacy. And I often emphasize that states are black boxes, and we should look at their actions, not their internal politics. But in Ukraine's case, Zelensky's internal politics became a factor of international security. His unwillingness to leave and his attempts to dictate terms to the great powers create friction within the Western alliance. This is exactly what Russia wants, the split between the U.S. and its European allies, as well as between Washington and Kyiv, is a strategic victory for Moscow. Minister Sabetha, by proposing a deal through the U.S., is essentially signing off on Ukraine's inability to defend its own interests independently. It is a cry for help disguised as a diplomatic initiative. But the U.S. will not make a deal with Russia for the sake of Ukraine. They will make a deal with Russia for the sake of the U.S. And if this deal requires recognizing Zelensky as illegitimate or his removal, Washington will do so without hesitation. We need to look the truth in the face. The entire rules-based world order that liberals love to talk about is collapsing before our eyes. We are returning to a 19th century world where the fates of nations were decided at congresses of great powers. Ukraine is the first major example of this return. And those who do not understand this, like Zelensky with his demands, are doomed to be crushed by the wheels of history. I want to emphasize once more, geopolitics is a brutal business. There is no room for resentment or hope for a miracle. There are only interests and power. Zelensky's new conditions are an attempt to ignore this truth. But reality always takes its toll. Sooner or later, a power will appear in Kyiv that accepts the terms dictated by the balance of power. And the sooner this happens, the lower the price the Ukrainian people will have to pay for the errors of their leaders. We live in an era of change where old alliances disintegrate and new challenges require sober calculation. The situation in Ukraine is only part of the global picture, but it teaches us an important lesson. Never stake your survival on the goodwill of great powers if you cannot offer them something in return besides problems. Zelensky is currently offering only problems, and therefore his time as a significant player is coming to an end. This is my analysis of the situation based on facts and the logic of realism. If we continue to develop this thought, we will see that the very phrasing of the question regarding international recognition and Zelensky's legitimacy in exchange for concessions is paradoxical. Concessions in international relations usually concern territory, resources, military restrictions, or alliances. But legitimacy is not something that can be exchanged for troop withdrawal or a ceasefire within a realist framework. Legitimacy is the foundation upon which relations are built. If there is no foundation, there is nothing to exchange. Zelensky is trying to turn his weakness into an asset. He says, if you do not recognize me, you get nothing. But the truth is that Russia believes it can get everything it needs without talking to him at all. This is the strategic blindness of the Kyiv leadership. They believe in their indispensability, while for Moscow, and already to a large extent for Washington, they have become interchangeable parts in the great machinery of global politics. Look at the situation with Trump. His coercion to elections is not just a whim. It is a way to legitimize the future U.S. departure from active support for Ukraine. If someone else wins the elections, the U.S. can say they fulfilled their duty to democracy, and now it's the business of the new Ukrainian government to solve its problems with Russia. If Zelensky wins, but on the terms of participation of all citizens, including those in Russia, he will become a different politician with a different mandate, perhaps a mandate for peace at any price. Russia's strategy in this matter deserves separate mention. Putin uses legal formalism as both a shield and a sword. By declaring Zelensky's illegitimacy, He creates a situation where any Western proposal for negotiations with the current regime hits a wall. This forces the West to either admit the illegitimacy of their protege or continue a pointless war that exhausts their own resources. This is a classic stalemate created by a great power to wear down its opponents. The gesture of despair, written about by journalist Jan Schwelt, is a very accurate description. When a leader starts demanding recognition of his legality from an enemy, it means he has lost the support of his friends or at least stopped trusting them. Zelensky feels the ground slipping from under his feet. His attempt to pressure Trump through a refusal of concessions to Moscow is an extremely risky game. Trump is not a man who reacts well to blackmail, especially from leaders of client states. Overall, the whole construction with Minister Sybiha and Special Envoy Dmitriev shows how deeply Ukraine is pulled into American internal politics, and this is always dangerous for a small state. By becoming a tool in the struggle between political factions in the U.S., Ukraine risks becoming a victim with any change of power in Washington. Trump may use Ukraine as a way to strike at Biden's legacy, and Zelensky, in this case, will simply become collateral damage. We must also understand that the absence of lawful authority in Kyiv from the Kremlin's perspective makes it impossible to sign any treaty that would have binding force in the future. Russia does not want a repeat of the Yanukovych or Poroshenko situations where agreements were torn up or ignored. They need someone who will possess indisputable power and who will be ready to guarantee the fulfillment of conditions. Zelensky, whose term has expired and whose status is contested even within his own country, is not suitable for this role. Therefore, all these maneuvers with new conditions are just an attempt to delay the finale. Zelensky is trying to create the appearance that he still controls the process, but the process has long been out of his control. Great powers are determining the parameters of the future world, and these parameters include the neutralization of Ukraine and the recognition of Russia's security interests. In this new reality, there is simply no place for Zelensky and his current course. I often say that international politics is a struggle for power and prestige, and Zelensky's prestige in the West is rapidly falling. He is no longer perceived as a hero saving democracy. He is starting to be perceived as a stubborn leader who delays the inevitable and demands too much. And when prestige vanishes, only naked power remains, and Ukraine's power is becoming less and less. In this context, Dmitriev's visit to Miami takes on special significance. This is a sign that Russia has already started negotiating with the future U.S. administration. And the fact that Zelensky's interests are not represented there speaks for itself. Great powers talk over the heads of small countries. It may seem unfair, but such is the reality of the international system in which we live. Ignoring this reality means committing strategic suicide. Zelensky hopes that his recognition will become a condition for peace, but in reality, his departure will likely become the condition for peace. This is a bitter pill he will have to swallow. And no demands, no appeals to international law will change this fact. History moves forward, and it does not stop for those who fail to adapt to changes in the balance of power. We are witnessing the end of a certain chapter in the history of Europe. The chapter where the West believed it could ignore Russia and redraw the borders of spheres of influence at its discretion is closing. The new chapter will be written in the language of realism, and in it, Ukraine will have to find its place as a neutral buffer between great powers. And the faster the leaders in Kyiv understand this, the better it will be for them and for their people. But for now, we only see gestures of despair and attempts to hold on to the wreckage of the old world. Look at this from the perspective of systems theory. The international system always strives for equilibrium. The conflict in Ukraine is the result of a violation of this equilibrium by NATO expansion. Now the system is trying to return to a state of balance. This is a painful process, and Ukraine is at its epicenter. Zelensky is only one element of the system, and if he interferes with the restoration of balance, the system will squeeze him out. His demand for recognition is an attempt to resist systemic pressure. But the strength of an individual, or even an individual small state, is not enough to stop the movement of tectonic plates of geopolitics. Russia, the US, and China are the main players who determine the direction of this movement. Ukraine made a mistake by deciding that it could be a player of the same level or that its security would be forever guaranteed by one of the great powers without accounting for the interests of the other. Now we see the consequences of this error. Zelensky is trying to bargain for his legitimacy, but legitimacy in the international system is a derivative of power and the consent of great powers. Without this consent, his demands remain just words. Ultimately, we must recognize that the world we knew after the Cold War is gone forever. We've returned to classic great power competition, where the interests of small countries are considered only when they coincide with the interests of the strong. This is a harsh world, and there's no room in it for illusions. Zelensky's new conditions are the last illusion of a leader who refuses to admit that the rules of the game have changed. But the rules have changed, and those who do not want to play by the new rules ultimately find themselves out of the game. Thus, my analysis remains unchanged. We see the agony of a political strategy that was not based on reality. Zelensky can put forward any conditions, but the reality on the battlefield and in the offices of great powers dictates a different scenario. This scenario involves a regime change in Kiev, holding elections on terms that suit Moscow and Washington, and ultimately, the neutralization of Ukraine. Everything else is just noise designed to hide this obvious finale. And as realists, we must see this finale through the fog of propaganda and desperate statements. The future will show how quickly this transformation occurs, but the direction of travel is already set. Geopolitics does not forgive mistakes, and Ukraine is now paying the highest price for not understanding how the world actually works. And Zelensky, with his demands for recognition, is a symbol of this misunderstanding, but the world will not wait for him to realize his mistakes. The world moves on, restoring the balance of power that was disrupted and leaving behind those who could not change in time. Let me conclude this reasoning with one more important thought. Great powers do not have permanent friends. They have only permanent interests. Today, the interests of the US and Russia are starting to slowly drift toward the necessity of freezing the Ukrainian conflict, though for different reasons. For the US, it is China. For Russia, it is consolidating achievements and economic restoration. In this convergence of interests, Zelensky becomes a redundant element. His desperate demands are an attempt to remind everyone of himself. But in the world of realpolitik, those who become a burden are forgotten very quickly. This is a hard truth, but it is the truth we must recognize if we want to call ourselves objective analysts. I would like to add that the situation with Zelensky's international recognition highlights another aspect of realism, the importance of internal unity and legitimacy for the stability of a state. When a leader is forced to ask external players to confirm his right to power, it is an admission that within the country, his power is weakened or fragmented. The war temporarily united Ukraine, but as the war's goals become increasingly vague and the costs unbearable, old cracks are starting to show again. Trump's demands for elections are a strike at exactly this weak point. It is an attempt to expose Ukraine's internal contradictions and make them work toward achieving American goals. Zelensky understands that in conditions of open political struggle, he may lose everything. His attempt to set conditions for Moscow is also a way to show his people that he is still a strong leader capable of dictating terms to Putin himself. But it is a bluff, and all participants in the process understand this. In the great game, there is no place for a bluff that cannot be backed by real force. Russia has force, the US has force, and Ukraine has only dependency. And this dependency makes any conditions from Zelensky meaningless. Ultimately, the decision will be made not based on his demands, but based on what the great powers consider necessary to stabilize the system. And this is perhaps the most important conclusion we can draw from this entire situation. Realism teaches us to look at the world as it is, not as we would like it to be. And the world today tells us that the time for political games in Kiev is coming to an end, yielding to the harsh reality of great powers.